Welcome to Excel Campus. My name is John, and in this video, I'm going to explain how to install the automatic number formatting for pivot tables macro in your Personal Macro Workbook. So I have a whole nother video that explains the macro and how it works. And in this video, we're going to take a look at how to actually install it and implement it in your own workbook, in your Personal Macro Workbook. And just real quick, in case you didn't see that other video, basically when we typically add a field to the values area of the pivot table, it's not formatted and it looks ugly like this here. So we have this macro that adds a button here to the right click menu, and it's called automatic number formatting. And I can just click that to turn it on. And now when we add a field to the values area, it's automatically formatted. This number formatting is applied, and that it automatically detects the number format in the source data range. So we can see here's the revenue column here, and here's this accounting style number format that's been applied to the revenue column. And that's exactly what's applied here in the pivot table as well. And we can also specify a default format in case there's no formatting applied in our source data range, or our source data range does not exist in this workbook. All right, so I'm first going to explain how to install the macro in your Personal Macro Workbook, and then I'll walk through and explain exactly how it works. So the first step here is to open the file that you downloaded that contains the macros. And once you have this file open, we're going to jump into the VB editor, Alt F11, or go to the Developer tab and click the Visual Basic button, and that will open the VB editor. And over here on the left side in the project window, we have our workbook here that we just opened, and then you should also have your Personal Macro Workbook open, which will be this personal.xlsb. If you don't have a Personal Macro Workbook yet, I have a whole nother video series that explains how to create that and start using it. So I'm going to assume you have one already. If not, go watch that video. I'll put a link below this video. And so then the next step is really pretty easy. We're just going to copy these two modules down here. We're first going to copy this class module into our Personal Macro Workbook, and we can just do that with drag and drop. So I'm going to take this, left click and hold, and then drag it up here until the personal highlights, the Personal Macro Workbook highlights, and then left click or let go of the mouse button. And we'll see here in the class modules folder, we have that C events class module right there. And then we're going to do the same thing with this code module here, pivot format. So left click and drag it up here until we get that highlighted, and then release. And then that one will be in the code module folder right here. So now that we have both of those in here, let's go ahead and close this workbook that contains the macros that we downloaded. That way we don't have any conflict or it's not confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and close this file here. And now we can jump back into the VB editor. This time I'm just going to press Alt F11, and we will go into the pivot format module. So again, I'm here in the Personal Macro Workbook. I'm going to double click the pivot format module here. And there's quite a few different macros within this module, and I'll explain those in a bit. But to just get it installed and get going, we're going to scroll down a little bit here to this macro right here, add auto formatting toggle button. So just left click anywhere inside that, and then hit the run button here, or F5 on the keyboard. And that'll add the context menu, or add the button to the context menu, which is the right click menu in the pivot tables. So now we can open or go to Excel and open a file that contains pivot tables. I already have one open right here. And if we right click on any pivot table in any area of the pivot table, we'll see the option here, automatic number formatting. And once we install it and run that macro, it's set to be off, as we can see now, or disabled, and we can just left click to enable it. And then when we right click again, we'll see that it's highlighted, and that lets us know it's enabled. So now, again, as we saw before, if we were to, we'll just remove revenue here and add it to the values area again, or add quantity here, we can see these numbers are automatically formatted. So now the big question is, how does this all work? Which is probably what you're wondering. And this is definitely a workaround to a common problem that we kind of deal with every day with formatting numbers, something that should be easy but takes a lot of time. So this is a bit of a workaround, but it does work, as we can see here. So I'll explain the workaround and how this all works. So if we go back into the VB editor and go to our Personal Macro Workbook, the first thing is I'm going to double click the see the events class module here. And in here we have the pivot table update event. Now, typically when you add the pivot table update event to one of your projects, one of your workbooks, you're doing that within a sheet module. So if we go here and expand this out, the Microsoft Excel objects folder here, and double click into a sheet module, typically you'll go worksheet here and then pivot table update event right here and choose that. And that would add this pivot table update event. And this macro is going to run whenever you make a change or an update to a pivot table in this specific sheet. Now you can also add this event to the this workbook as well, to the this workbook module, and in which case when you do that here, let's find it, it's under sheet pivot table update. When you add it here, then it's going to run, the macro will run when you update any pivot table in this workbook. However, we want this macro to run on any workbook we have open. We don't want to just be limited to always putting this code inside of one single workbook and having to copy it around. And fortunately, we can do that with what are called application events or app events. And that's exactly what this class module does. So if I jump back to the class module here, the events module, that's what's happening here. And I've linked up in the pivot format module. If you double click here and scroll up to the top, I put two links here to articles on app events. There's a great one by Chip Pearson and then one by Microsoft as well that talk more about application events and how to install them. But really what's happening here is we're using this class module, and it's really just kind of always monitoring or always on once we turn it on, and we turn it on through that right click menu, and I'll explain that in a bit. But once it's on, then whenever we make a change or an update to any pivot table in any workbook that we have open, this event is going to fire. So this macro here is going to run. So that's really how it works with these app events. And you just have to declare this variable as an application, and then you do that in a code module as well to declare it and set the variable to an instance, so it knows it's running, and then it's kind of always monitoring your events. So that's basically how it works. So this macro here, then what it's doing is every time an update or a change is made to a pivot table, it's going here and looking, basically looping through each pivot field in the active pivot table. So the pivot table that we're currently working in, that's the target returns the active pivot table, and that's done here in the parameter from the pivot table update event. So we get that pivot table that we're currently working in, which is returned here, and then we're just looping through all the data fields. So those are the fields in the values area of the pivot table that we're looping through right here, and we're checking each field to see if the number format is set as general, because general is that default number format, that ugly number format that's used by the pivot table. So we're just checking to see if the field is formatted as general. And then if it is, we're going to then either look up the formatting used in the source formatting, the source data range, or we're just going to set a default number format, which is set up here. Now you can of course change this. This is just a comma with no decimal places, very simple number format, but you can go in here and paste in any number format between the quotation marks there that you want as a default. So if your source data range is just formatted to general, like if we go back over here to Excel, in our source data range, the quantity column here, we can see it's just formatted as general, just the general format type. However, when we add the quantity to the pivot table like we did here, we don't get the general formatting, we get that number format that I had specified there, that comma number format. So that's how it's working. It's just defaulting to that because the source data range is formatted as general. Now, if the source data range is formatted to something other than general, like in the case of the shipping fee column or the revenue column here, revenue is using an accounting style number format here with no decimal places, then the macro will detect that when we add revenue to the values area here and then apply that formatting. So if we jump back to the macro, we can learn a little bit more about how that works. And then also, just before I move on, you can see that we're using this application international property here to get the general format name. This constant returns the general format name for international versions of Excel. So if you're using a different language version of Excel, this will return whatever general is in your language to this variable, and then again do that checking for each field in the data fields in this loop right here. Okay, so how do we detect the source format, formatting, the number formatting in the source data range? That is done by this function right here that I wrote, and this function is actually in the pivot format module. So this is what's happening here in this first line. It's attempting to get the source formatting from for that field that we've added, and this is returning the source name or the name of the field that we just added to the pivot table, and get that source formatting. And to do that, it calls this function. So if we go here, and then the function is right down here for down here in this formatting macros section, we have this source formatting function, and we're just passing through the field name here as a string, and then that's going to then get the source data range, which is what it's doing here. It's getting the source data range right here, setting the source data range, and then finding the first cell within the column of that field right here, and finding that, and then finding the number format for that first cell in the column, and then setting that to the result of the function. And if it can't find the number format, or if it can't find the source data range, if the source data range is in another workbook, then it won't find it. Or if you're using the data model and the source data range just does not exist in a worksheet within this workbook that you're currently in, then it'll just set it equal to blank, and then we'll default back to that general, or that, I'm sorry, not the general, but the default number formatting that you set up in the macro. And then I forgot to mention that we're also using this get pivot source function here to get that source data range. And that's another function right down here that you can use to get the source data range or return the source data range for any pivot table. So these are functions that you can use outside of this macro as well to get a source data range or get some number formatting for a specific field in the pivot table itself. Okay, so that should explain the pivot table update event. Again, that's this update event here that's going to run anytime we make a change to the pivot table or update the pivot table as well. So one important thing to note here is that because it's running every time we update or refresh the pivot table even, if you do have some existing pivot tables and you want those pivot tables to keep the general number formatting for whatever reason, then when you're working with those, it's best to go and turn the automatic number formatting off. And again, that's very easy to do. You can just go into Excel, right click, and then right click pivot table, and then turn the automatic number formatting off. If you right click again, you'll see that it's disabled and off. And then when you do any kind of update or modification to the pivot table, the number formatting will not be applied and those macros will not run. So that's why I put the toggle there on the right click menu, because you might not always want this on, because it is going to run anytime you do any change to the pivot table. Now I'm thinking about adding some features that would actually kind of determine and kind of store the current number of fields in the values area, and then only run it if a new field is added to the pivot table. I think that's something we can definitely do as well to make this maybe a little more robust. But it does work right now as is. Just know that you want to turn it off if for any reason you don't want number formatting applied. That's not the general format. If it's already formatted here, and even if you go and change this number format within the pivot table and then update or refresh, it's not going to rerun the number formatting onto to the source data range. It's not going to go through that again. It's only going to run that if this number formatting is set to general right here within the pivot table. So again, just good to know how that works there. So I'm going to jump back into the VB editor, and we'll take a look at some of the other macros here in the pivot format module. So we scroll up, we kind of talked about the pivot table update event and how all the number formatting works, but there are some additional macros here that I wanted to explain as well. So the first ones are these app events up at the top, which again turn the app events on and off, and that's the app event that's always monitoring any pivot table change or update, and it's going to run when we make any change, any pivot table in any workbook. So this macro here just toggles the app events on and off to add the button or not add the button, but to change the state of the button when we right click it from the right click menu. This macro here will set the instance of that object for the app event to the application. So that means it's on and running. And then if we run this macro here, that'll kill it or set it to nothing. So the app events will not run. So if we refresh a pivot table or something like that, the app event will not run once we run this macro, and that macro is called again by the toggle event here for the right-click menu. So the right-click menu is created down here in the context menu, section. We have this macro here to add the auto-formatting toggle button to the right-click menu, and that's only for the pivot table right-click menu, or what are called context menus. So this macro here does that. I forgot to put the source here, but there's a good article by Ron DeBruin on how these work, and I'll put the source link there so you can check that out as well. There's a great article on this, but basically we're just adding a button here to the pivot table context menu. Here's where we're adding the control for that button, and down here we're naming the button and then tagging it, and then the on action event is what's going to, or the on action property is what's going to call the macro, that toggle app event object macro to turn the events on and off is really all it's doing. And then this is the icon there. Face ID is the icon. So that's really how that works. Then we have a macro here to delete the formatting as well. And so when the Personal Macro Workbook opens, we're automatically going to add that button to the right-click menu. And that's done right up here through this auto open macro. So this auto open macro runs every time the Personal Macro Workbook opens. This is kind of like an event or an app event itself, or this workbook event really, but it's called auto open. And I just put it here so you don't have to add something to this workbook event. It's just right here. And so every time you open the Personal Macro Workbook, which means every time you open Excel, this macro is going to run, which just calls this macro here to add the toggle button to the right-click menu. So every time you open Excel, the toggle button, or the toggle button on the right-click menu, or the button, the automatic formatting button on the right-click menu will be added. And then when you close Excel and close Personal Macro Workbook, it'll be deleted as well. And when you open up Excel, the toggle will be off. So the automatic number formatting will be off by default. Now, if you want it to always turn on by default when you open Excel, you can just uncomment this line of code right here. Just uncomment this or delete that apostrophe right there. And then when the Personal Macro Workbook opens, it's going to call the toggle to turn the automatic number formatting on. So that's an option there too. I just didn't want it to automatically turn on for you and you didn't know it, but you can toggle that on or off as you'd like to have it automatically open. And in the PivotPal add-in, I have an option built into the registry here so it remembers what your last setting was. And then next time you open Excel, it will remember that and set it to whatever, whether you have it on or off, it sets it to whatever you had last time you had Excel open. But in this case here, I don't have that code in here, so you can just either comment this out or leave it uncommented if you want to always keep the automatic number formatting on when you open Excel. Okay, so I know that was a lot of explanation, but hopefully that helps you understand how this all works to create some nicely formatted pivot tables without having to take that extra step to format the numbers in the values area. And of course, I recommend stepping through the code as well. You can add a breakpoint to any of the macros here. Especially these formatting macros, you can just add a breakpoint to the top, and then when they run, macro stop here, and you can hit F8 on the keyboard to step through each line of code and see how it all works and how it's running if you want to learn more about VBA. And then of course, I also have a free 3-part video series on getting started with macros in VBA if you want to learn that as well. So I hope this helps. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please leave a comment below and I'll be happy to help answer them. If you'd like to learn more about macros and VBA, then I have a free 3-part video training series that will really help you out. In the first video, we write our first macro, and I also explain the Excel object model. If you've ever wondered what the dots between the words mean and what order the code runs in, then this video is for you. In the second video, we automate a common Excel task to create a summary report of all the sheets in the workbook. And finally, in the third video, we build a user form to export the sheets out of the workbook. You can learn more and sign up for the free training at excelcampus.com/macros. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.